I studied the role of the multinational consulting firms in the process of government restructuring in the UK, in Canada, and in France from the 1960s to the year 2000 approximately. So for 40 years old, for a period of 40 years. And what attracted me to that topic at first was, well, nobody had ever written anything about this, you know, because we used to think that government reform was the business of civil servants. You know, they're the one advising the politician on how to manage the state, on how to administrate public affairs. So the coming in of actors from the private sector, like management consultant, was a relatively new phenomenon. And it came with with the rise of the new public management in the 1980s, following the election of Reagan, Thatcher, and so forth. You know the story. And with the rise of the new public management came the ideology that private sector management is superior to public sector management, right? And that government, that the state should copy or at least emulate a private sector management technique in order to be more efficient. And so with this ideology, well, governments all over the world started to use more and more management consultant as advisor in terms of public management. Because the idea was that consultants, since they advise the most important corporation in the world, so they know what is good private sector management, and they would be useful to transfer this knowledge from the private sector to the public sector. So that's the discourse, the theory that politicians use to justify their growing use of management consultant in the public sector. But in the end, even though government in Britain, Canada, and France, and in many other places, even though they spend billions of dollars on private consultant, do we know if public management is better today, more efficient, more cost-effective than it was before we use consultant? That we don't have any solid empirical evidence to help us answer that question. The best we can say is that we don't know. Government do use a lot of private sector advisor, but does this make government more efficient? It's not so sure, not so sure. But what was most surprising in that research is that for management consultant, the private sector was the main source of revenues and profit for most of their existence. But this started to change during the 1990s, and the government became one of their biggest clients, you know, making more profits from government, and consultant became consulting firm became more proactive in recruiting former senior bureaucrats into their companies. And so, for instance, when I interview people at Price Waterhouse in their London office, they had a government consulting division within their empire, and most of the people who worked in the government consulting division were former civil servants. But can you see the irony? Government use private sector consultant because they say they will help us bring private sector know-how, but these consultants know nothing about private sector management because they spend their life as bureaucrat in government. So that was one of the major findings of that research, among others. Well, it came to the realization of this revolving door between government and big consulting firms, and and it came also as just a curiosity because this happened, the shift in my research happened at a moment when government all over the democratic world at least began to express worries about declining public trust in government, in institution. And how could they best help to regain public trust, right? And in trying to regain public trust, many government and parliament, they adopted so-called ethics code and codes of conduct to guide the conduct of their members. And this for me was this what attracted my attention because this was a new area of public policy. There was no policy before about trying to codify the behavior of public officials. And I thought to myself, oh, that's an interesting topic to study because it has not been done before and it raises many questions, especially in terms of theory. Because whenever you have politicians promising to fight corruption, well, these politicians, they're the one making the law. They're the one making the policies, right? And what is particularly interesting in the case of political ethics is that you have politicians making law that target themselves. You know, that's the problem I was interested to study, because one famous scholar in the United States, Denis Saint-Martin, has called that an institutional conflict of interest, when a public official makes rules regarding himself and his or her colleagues, right? So, and that's what was intriguing to me. And so that's why I started to study parliamentary and government ethics, because it raised the question of politicians who are in a position to make law regarding themselves, you know, and it put them in a position where they need to show to the public that they are taking their concerns seriously, but at the same time they are making rules that makes their life more difficult. And they don't like these rules, you know, because now if you are a public official, well, you have to be very transparent about your wealth. For instance, you have to disclose your financial interests. You have to disclose the interests of your wife, husband, children, and everything. So many politicians think that ethics rule, to make them more ethical, are very intrusive in terms of their privacy, and they don't like these rules. But they need to be seen as doing something because because this is supposed to help the public regain confidence in institutions. So that's the dilemma I wanted to study. In the study of corruption, and really anti-corruption policy and research has become an industry. That's I call that as others have before me, the anti-corruption industry. They have a product to sell, and they have an issue that they want to keep on the agenda. And I am all sympathetic toward these goals. But the problem I find is that in anti-corruption research, there is one theory that dominates all other, and it's the economic approach to the study of corruption, the so-called rational choice model or the new institutional economics. And these theories, they focus on the structure of incentive, right? They say if you want to try to reduce corruption in a given organizational settings, you have to change the incentive structure within which actors navigate, right? So these economic model only focus on the formal side of the equation because they say change the incentive structure, build that institution, create that new rule, and this will change the behavior of individual. My problem with these approaches is that they tend to see human beings as economic calculator, and they design policy that tweak with the incentive structure, but always in a calculative mode, if I may say, and they leave aside the psychological, the emotional, the sociological side of human action. And I think that's a big mistake. I think because one thing we know, Kidjie, is that if you ask politicians to fight corruption, they will be very good at adopting laws, at creating new bureaucracies, at creating new administrative structures, because politicians are very good at that. But you can create all the structures you want, adopt all the laws you want, but in the end, this might not change the behavior of people who are active in corruption networks. You have to only, if you take only the formal side of the equation and you leave the informal side, I think you're not going to do a lot of progress. Well, in economic model, the behavior will be changed by tweaking with the incentive structures. But your question about institutional change is especially relevant in situation of so-called systemic corruption. Because when you look at most studies on systemic corruption, generally they have a model of institutional change that is based on a punctuated equilibrium approach to the study of institution. That is, you have systemic corruption and it goes on and on for a long period of time. Then there's a critical juncture, a crisis, a war, a revolution, then big bang, the institution changed suddenly, and then you might enter into a or a less corrupt era. And this is the model of change that we are being provided by most study, what I call the Big Bang model of institutional change. Society is deeply corrupt, but then there's a war, there's a revolution, and then we break the corrupt cycle and enter a new corruption-free cycle. So if you ask then, well, how do we go from A to B? Well, this research will tell you, well, you do this in a big revolution. There will be a leader, like here in Singapore, a famous, wise leader who come and who makes, who breaks all the rules and reinvent a new world, right? I find those explanations very limited because they tend to look at corruption as something that can be eliminated in a sudden way, and they tend to separate what they study in terms of before and after. There was the revolution, and then we created new institution, and corruption disappeared. But my point is that corruption is not so easy to get rid of. Yes, you can have big revolution like you had in Singapore with this new leader, for instance, that break the cycle of systemic corruption, but that doesn't mean that corruption will not adapt to the new institution that have been built by the new leader, okay? So because corruption is good at it, at adapting and as changing its way. And if you think about corruption in terms of a big bang, well, you forget to think that, oh, it is able to survive the revolution and to adapt in different way. So that's my main critique of this model. I think we are better to study corruption with theories of institutional evolution, not punctuated equilibrium, because evolution means, okay, there was no big bang, there was no sudden rupture, that things evolve incrementally. For instance, in my in the society from which I come from, in Canada, in the province of Quebec, there was a big quiet revolution in the 1960s that broke the cycle of systemic corruption that existed before. But even with this so-called quiet revolution, this did not abolish corruption forever. Corruption just, they just corruption network, they just adapt to the new environment and they learn the new rule of the game and they continue to do their work, if I may say. So that's my main critique about theories of institutional change in corruption research. Most research is founded on a Big Bang model, and I think that's not really helpful. And I'm working on a project at the moment which is about varieties of crony capitalism, because I think his approach of varieties of capitalism is extremely relevant to understand the phenomenon of modern corruption, because corruption is something that lives aside the market economy, right? It's always there, and it's and different type of political economy, liberal or coordinated market economy, they will have different type of corruption networks, because these are political economy that operate on different principles and practices and belief. So what I got from that is that this way of looking at the world is extremely fruitful to study corruption, because it helps you to identify weaknesses in political economies where corruption might lies. For instance, in liberal political economy, lobbying is a major source of corruption. But lobbying is a phenomenon that is more characteristic of so-called liberal market economy than coordinated market economy. So different type of political economy will create different incentive structure to make corruption more or less possible. I think at least nowadays we have a better understanding of what looks like this so-called post-bureaucratic state, and what we see is that government in many, at least advanced capitalist democratic countries, you see that government operate more and more in partnership with the private sector, so-called PPP, or public-private partnership, so and that means that the business sector especially has increasingly become a co-pilot in the steering of the ship of state, right? And this has become increasingly visible in many countries. So the post-bureaucratic state is certainly a state where the private sector is being given an increasingly visible role in the steering of the state. And that raises many questions, right? That raises many questions. But this we knew already. We knew already from the work of people like Charles Lindblom. Because, as Lindblom said, Well, in a democratic capitalist system, the business sector will always have a special place, because with the rise of the welfare state, nowadays, politicians, they win election mostly on one thing: creating job and wealth. Mhm. And who has the end on the lever to create jobs and wealth? It's the private sector, right? Mostly. So yes, so already from Lindblom, we knew that the business sector was occupy a privileged position, with government and in the steering of the state. But nowadays, it becomes more and more visible, Maybe before, only a few political scientists were really clever had seen that, but nowadays it's becoming more and more clear. And this raises a lot of crucial questions for accountability, responsiveness, democracy, and so forth. And since government and business are working more closely with each other, well then, what is the public interest in a situation like that, Because government will say, well, what is good for a major companies in our country is good for the public interest, Like the saying, what is good for Ford is good for the United States. So the private interest of corporation and the public interest of the nation are being totally merged in one same thing. And this creates many possibilities for wrongdoing and corruption, right? I read the paper recently, and as you know, the British government has to deal with Brexit, of course, but they don't have any in-house capacity to handle the Brexit file, so they contracted out all the expertise to management consultants. So consultants are going basically to do all the work for the Brexit, This example shows you that the issue of consultants and their role in the policy process is still very something relevant and of actual, of current. It is becoming more difficult for the big consulting firm to claim that they are totally independent from government, because they've become such an important collaborator for policymakers that, they've built a symbiotic relationship with the state to some extent. And that creates some issues for management consultant because they're so involved in the public policy process now. I have seen consulting firms transforming themselves or creating think tank. So they've become, consultant used to be private business, and nowadays they are transmuting into think tank, because most of their business is about giving advice to policymakers. And this is exactly what think tanks are doing. The difference is that think tanks, it will not cost you $10 million to produce a report, but McKinsey or Accenture produce a report that will be very costly, very costly. So the issue of conflict of interest between this closer and closer relationship between the consulting industry and government, this is something that wasn't there to the same extent as it is nowadays. And that's a big issue. That's a big issue. I guess it should. But this would go against the idea that government should interfere in private business, right? That's it. So government will suggest, will incentivize private consultant, private industry, to have codes of conduct that are self-regulated and so forth. But are they effective? That's another issue. That's another issue. But you are totally right to say that this raises an important question for ethics management among the big consulting firms. Absolutely. Absolutely. For one thing, the phenomenon of government using the advice of private sector consultant is now more widespread than it was when I started to study it almost 20 years ago. Now it's more widespread. Government, I'm thinking about the British, the Canadian, the American government, among others, the French government as well. The rising cost in their use of consultant has attracted the attention of the media, of the political opposition. In the UK, the political opposition would ask the Prime Minister, this year you spent £100 million on consulting advice, and what did it lead to, right? So there was a question that too much government money was being spent on consultant without enough accountability. And these critiques led government to be much more transparent about their use of consultant. Me, when I started to research on consultant, there was absolutely no data available. But now you go on the website and you will say, well, we spent 10 million on consultant, 1 million to your firm, what? So you have much more detailed information. So in that sense, younger researchers now have access to a much broader range of data that they can use to measure the extent of the use of consultant by government. So that's one thing, that there are more data nowadays, so that's more easily accessible. And it depends. The advice I would give to students who are interested in the field, it depends, because the consulting industry is extremely fragmented and there's a lot of variety. You know, there are the small boutique, then you have the big multinational who dominate the global market. So it depends whether you are interested in smaller consulting firm, in the bigger one. I'll tell you a story, for students, and that's good advice. I did my PhD in Canada in a university called Carleton University, and I was a good PhD student, and I said to myself, okay, I'm going to write letters to the head of those big consulting firms and ask for interviews and if I can have a look at their archives to dig some information for my research. So I wrote letters to the so-called Big Five firm, Ernst & Young, Price Cooper, Waterhouse, Accenture, McKinsey, all the biggest players. And I wrote the letter with the letterhead of my university in Canada. So I sent like 30 letters in Paris, London, Washington, and Ottawa. I got no responses at all. No responses at all. I finished my PhD. I got a scholarship to go at Harvard for 2 years to study with Peter Hall. I arrived at Harvard in my new office. I still had my letter on my computer. So I changed the date. I print them on Harvard letterhead. Within 24 hours, I got invitation from all over the world. So this example shows you, me as a researcher, I was the same person, right? But the fact that I belong to a very prestigious institution gave me access to people that I would not otherwise have had. And for me, that was very revealing. So as researcher, our social position, our institutional location and things like that, it has a very big influence on our ability to access certain worlds that gives us the information we need or we seek, right? So, so young researchers, if you're looking at this field, you know, don't be discouraged because it's difficult to have access. But if you study consultant in smaller firm, I would assume that the access to the researcher is a bit easier, right? Whereas the big multinational, that's more complicated. They're more opaque in their functioning. Maybe what I will say is will appear paradoxical. I would say teaching and having good students. You know, I think some people tend to think that teaching and research are two opposite things. That if you teach too much, your research will suffer. Me, I find the teaching give me the energy to do my research. You know, from my students, I get all the question, all the curiosity, and this gives me the energy then to go back into my office and write my papers. So I would say teaching is something that keeps your mind always sharp and always curious. So I'm not of the school that think that that teaching and research are opposite. On the contrary. That's a good question. I don't know if my answer will be, I'll go in directly, okay? I'm a student of bureaucracy. As professor of public administration, we study bureaucrats and what they do, and because we think it is important. And in most of the research on good governance, for instance, you will read a book and always at the end or somewhere, you know, the conclusion will be to have good governance, you have to have good, neutral, professional, impartial bureaucrats. That's the key to success. If you have a good bureaucracy, then economic growth, social progress will come with it, right? And it is true. Throughout human history, we can see that, of course, countries that have good bureaucracy, like you have here in Singapore, that's a treasure for society. That's something that is really useful. So there's the idea in our field in public administration that impartiality, public service impartiality, is the key to success, right? And I agree with that. But once you've said that, you have not said much. Because impartiality, what does it mean, you know? Does it mean that bureaucrats should be above the fray, totally isolated in their office with no contact with the rest of society? If that is what we mean when we think about impartiality, well, these bureaucrats will be useless. Because to be a good bureaucrat, you have to know what goes on in society. You have to have your finger, you know, on society to know what is going on. If you are a bureaucrat working in economic ministry, you have to know how the business sector, what they need, what, you know, to be able to support them and help them. So my interest is more about thinking in terms of what I call the social embeddedness of impartiality. Okay, how bureaucrat can interact socially with their client, with other organization, but at the same time in a real socially embedded way, you know, because if bureaucrats are totally isolated in their ivory tower, they won't be efficient, they will not be useful. They have to be on the ground with all sorts of social actors, but at the same time, they need to be able to remain neutral arbiter, right? And that's the challenge. So I don't know if I answered the question, but for me, the more sociological dimension to my work come from this social embeddedness approach that I think is more useful to think when we think about public service impartiality, how it has to be socially embedded. I think I think, and this goes on. This goes back to the question about the new public management. The new public management, politicians say, well, we need to copy the private sector because they're much more efficient than we are in government. And to copy the private sector, we will use management consultant. But all this discourse about the new public management was also a discourse about delegitimizing the civil service. Christopher Rode has written extensively about the delegitimization of the civil service. And then you have the decline of public trust. People no longer trust government. They don't trust public officials anymore. And then, okay, we say to restore public trust, we will have these code of ethics, codes of good governance. But that's paradoxical, because on the one hand, you have politicians who are delegitimizing civil servants, and then they want to restore integrity with ethics code. But I don't think it's going to work. I think what you have, I think what politician needs to do, policymaker needs to think about, is about the social esteem that people give to bureaucrats in a given society. If people in a given society, let's take the United States. If you tell your parents, Mom, Dad, I want to be a bureaucrat, your parents will cry and will say, we fail. As parents, we fail. Our kids is a loser. He wants to go work for the government. Because in America, a winner work in the private sector because that's where they make big money and that's where the brightest and the sharpest people go. Well, in a society, if you think that only the loser go work for government, well, it's going to be a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? So my point is that the political discourse needs to reintegrate a discourse about how noble it is to be a public servant, you know? And this is what we need to work on, you know, to restore the social esteem that people have toward bureaucrats. But if you have politicians always criticizing bureaucrats for being lazy and non-efficient, well, then people, well, of course, they won't have any trust toward government. So I think, because in many countries they say, we need to increase the salaries of bureaucrats so that they are, you know, more performant. I don't think, in my country at least, in a rich country, that increasing the salaries of bureaucrats is the key to success. I think the key to success is to restore the nobility of working for government. That government official, well, they are people that are important in society. You know, they are there to help others, and that's what I think would be most helpful than having all these ethics code and all these institutions. I think changing the discourse. The NPM comes with the belief that government management and private sector management are similar, and I think that's not a good starting point. You know, that's not a good starting point. The American, you know, they thought that because Mr. Trump was a successful business person, that he would be a successful president. It doesn't seem that way. Every time business people go into politics, they find politics messy and complicated. Because in the private sector, you're the boss, you give order, people obey. In politics, you don't, that's not how it works. You know, you have to negotiate all the time. And that's the different set of skills. So yes, the reversal of the new public management, you know, and this is not to denigrate private sector management at all. No, these are just two very different things. And there's need to be a renewal in terms of the discourse that needs to valorize to the public servants, you know, the work they do. This is what I think is more important. Well, for sure, my work on consultant, I'm known for this primarily. I would say my last article is the one I'm the most proud of. You know, that's our last baby is always the one we're most proud of. Um, uh, um, because, well, as you can hear from my accent, English is my second language, and I write in French and in English as well. So I have a few articles in French that are not as well known by English reader that I'm quite proud of. So I think one article on the institutionalization of ethics in politics was an important article. But I don't know if it's the article I would be remembered for. I'm not sure about that. For me, I think the key to be productive, to be happy in this work, in this line of work, is that in the social sciences, we are very different from the natural sciences. We are not observing rats in a laboratory. We are observing human beings toward whom we have feelings. So it is never possible in our line of work of completely detaching our own values from what we do. And I think it's not even a good idea to try to separate the two, because to work in this line, you have to have values. You have to feel passionate about something, because that's what is going to give you the energy to continue. So in the social sciences, I would say to those who are interested, you have to be passionate about something, whether equality, corruption, the environment, or there's global social justice. There are so many important issues. Well, of course, you have to do your research properly, not in an ideological or biased way. But that doesn't mean that you have to leave your values behind. Because they're still there. Because this is the reason why you do what you do.